John Lennon, a name that reverberates through the world of music, peace, and culture, one of the greatest musicians of all time, whose voice still echoes in the hearts of millions. But on December 8, 1980, that voice was silenced forever in a shocking and tragic moment that forever altered the course of music history. The question that remains is, how did John Lennon die? On that fateful night, Lennon's life came to an abrupt end in front of his New York apartment, leaving the world stunned and heartbroken. The impact of his death was immediate and profound, sparking an outpouring of grief from fans, fellow artists, and people all around the globe. But what exactly happened? Why did such a thing happen to someone who had spent his life preaching peace and love? Before we dive deeper into the events of that tragic day, take a moment to let us know where you're watching from in the comments below. And if you haven't already, make sure to hit that subscribe button and give us a thumbs up. It helps us continue bringing you stories like this. Now let's unravel the shocking truth behind the death of John Lennon. John Lennon was more than just a musician. He was an icon, a revolutionary figure whose influence stretched far beyond the realm of rock and roll. Born in Liverpool in 1940, Lennon grew up in a working-class family. His early life was marked by personal tragedies, losing his mother at a young age and growing up with his aunt, which undoubtedly shaped his rebellious and introspective character. But it was his gift for music that would ultimately define his life and the world's perception of him. In 1957, Lennon formed a band called the Quarrymen, which eventually morphed into the Beatles. Alongside Paul McCartney, George Harrison, and Ringo Starr, the Beatles became a global sensation. Lennon, with his sharp wit and poetic lyrics, emerged as one of the primary songwriters for the band, alongside McCartney. Hits like Help and Imagine became anthems not just of a generation, but of entire movements. The Beatles' rise to fame was nothing short of meteoric, and Lennon quickly became a symbol of both artistic innovation and cultural change. But Lennon's journey wasn't just about music. He was also a deeply philosophical figure, often using his platform to address social and political issues. His famous proclamation that the Beatles were bigger than Jesus in 1966 led to controversy and even book burnings in the southern United States. This controversy, however, highlighted Lennon's complex nature. He wasn't afraid to speak his mind and challenge societal norms. His bold statements, particularly those against war and injustice, made him both a hero and a target in the eyes of the public. As the Beatles disbanded in 1970, Lennon's journey took a different path. He transitioned into a solo career, releasing critically acclaimed albums like Imagine and Plastic Ono Band. These works delved deeper into his personal struggles, his views on peace, and his search for self-understanding. His song Give Peace a Chance became an anthem for the anti-war movement, cementing Lennon's place as an outspoken advocate for global harmony. He wasn't just making music, he was making a statement, one that challenged the establishment and urged the world to embrace peace and love over violence and division. At the time of his death, Lennon had moved to New York City with his wife, Yoko Ono. They had a young son, Sean, and were living a relatively quiet life compared to the frenzy of his earlier years. Lennon had retreated from the public eye for a while, focusing on his family and music. His album Double Fantasy, released in 1980, marked his return to the music scene after a 5-year hiatus. The album, which reflected his renewed relationship with Yoko and his focus on family, was a commercial success. The world was finally starting to see the more peaceful, reflective side of Lennon, a side that had been overshadowed by the chaos of his younger years. But just as Lennon seemed to be embracing a calmer phase of life, the world would be rocked by an unspeakable tragedy. His death would mark the end of an era in both music and culture. The circumstances surrounding his death, however, are as chilling as they are heartbreaking, and they continue to fuel discussions to this day. As 1980 progressed, John Lennon had begun to carve out a new chapter in his life. After years of global fame, controversy, and personal turmoil, he appeared to be at peace. His return to the music scene with Double Fantasy signaled a rejuvenated Lennon, both as an artist and as a person. The album's success, coupled with his joy of being a father again, painted a picture of a man settling into a quieter, more reflective existence. But beneath this calm surface, the world that Lennon had once known, one filled with activism, rebellion, and political unrest, was still in turmoil. In the United States, the Cold War was at its peak, and tensions between the superpowers remained high. The Vietnam War, which Lennon had actively protested against during the 1960s, still lingered in the collective memory of a divided nation. It was a time when the world seemed on the edge of conflict, with fear and uncertainty pervading many aspects of daily life. This social and political backdrop continued to influence Lennon's work and actions, even as he seemed to distance himself from the more radical activism of his younger years. Despite the apparent calm in Lennon's personal life, his past, actions, his outspoken views and his influence on the counterculture movement still left him vulnerable to scrutiny and criticism. The United States government had closely monitored Lennon throughout the 1970s, particularly because of his anti-war stance and the impact he had on young people. His political activities had earned him a reputation as a disruptive force, someone who wasn't afraid to challenge authority or question the status quo. But there was another, more personal factor at play, the presence of a man who had become obsessed with Lennon, Mark David Chapman. By 1980, Chapman had already become fixated on Lennon. He was a troubled individual, struggling with his own mental health issues and a distorted view of the world. The seeds of violence had been planted, and they were about to culminate in one of the most shocking moments in music history. Chapman's obsession with Lennon went beyond mere fandom. It morphed into something far more dangerous. As Lennon moved through his everyday life in New York, he couldn't have known that the very person who had admired him from afar was about to strike. The events leading up to the tragic day were in motion, and soon the peace Lennon had been searching for would be shattered forever. The evening of December 8, 1980, began like any other for John Lennon. He spent the day at his apartment in the Dakota, a historic building located on the Upper West Side of Manhattan, with his wife, Yoko Ono, and their young son, Sean. The family had been living in New York for several years, far removed from the chaos of Lennon's earlier career. Despite his fame, Lennon had managed to maintain a relatively quiet life in the city, occasionally venturing out to work on music or meet with friends. Earlier in the day, Lennon and Yoko had visited a recording studio, and it was during this time that a seemingly innocuous encounter would take place. Mark David Chapman, who had been lingering around the building, approached the Lennons. He was carrying a copy of The Catcher in the Rye, the novel by J.D. Salinger that had become a personal obsession of his. Chapman had spent much of the day hanging around waiting for the right moment to confront Lennon. The two spoke briefly, with Lennon being polite but unaware of the depth of Chapman's obsession. Later that evening, around 10:50 p.m., Lennon and Yoko returned to the Dakota after a night out. As they approached the entrance of the building, Chapman stepped forward, his intentions clear. He raised a .38 caliber revolver and fired 5 shots. 4 of those shots struck Lennon in the back and shoulder, and he collapsed immediately, bleeding heavily. Yoko screamed, and Lennon was rushed to the hospital, but by the time they arrived, it was too late. John Lennon had been pronounced dead at 11:15 p.m., just 45 minutes after being shot. Chapman, after committing the act, did not flee the scene. Instead, he calmly stood there, waiting for the police to arrive. When they did, he was immediately arrested without any resistance. He didn't try to run, nor did he seem to show any remorse. In fact, he was eerily calm and even told the officers that he had just shot John Lennon. When asked why he had done it, he cited the novel The Catcher in the Rye, claiming that Lennon was a phony and that he was doing the world a favor by killing him. This disjointed and delusional rationale would come to define Chapman's actions in the years that followed. The details of the assassination quickly became known to the public, and the world reacted with a mixture of disbelief, horror, and grief. Fans gathered outside the Dakota, holding vigil for the man who had become a symbol of peace and love. The streets of New York, which had been bustling with life just hours earlier, now felt eerily empty. News outlets across the globe broadcasted the tragic event, and social media, though still in its infancy, would soon be flooded with tributes from fans and artists alike. For many, the news felt unreal. John Lennon, the man who had written songs about peace, who had spent his life advocating for a better world, had been taken away so senselessly and violently. It was a moment that left a deep void in the hearts of millions and a reminder of how fragile life can be. Lennon's death was not just the loss of an artist, it was the loss of a symbol of hope. The aftermath of the shooting was just as surreal. As the news spread, tributes poured in from around the world. Fellow musicians like Paul McCartney, George Harrison, and Ringo Starr were left to grapple with the loss of a friend and bandmate. McCartney, who had shared both musical triumphs and personal struggles with Lennon, expressed his shock and sadness in a brief public statement. "I'm just trying to make sense of it," he said. The rest of the Beatles, too, were devastated by the loss, though each would respond in their own way, trying to process the grief of losing not just a colleague, but a dear friend. Lennon's death marked the end of an era. He was more than just a member of the Beatles. He had become an embodiment of the dreams and ideals of the 1960s, particularly the desire for peace and understanding in a divided world. The sense of loss was not just personal for those who knew him, but collective for a generation that had grown up with his music and activism. Lennon had been an integral part of the soundtrack to their lives, and now that music seemed to have been silenced forever. But the story didn't end there. The circumstances of Lennon's death would spark countless questions, debates, and investigations, some of which remain unresolved to this day. Why did Chapman, a man with no apparent connection to Lennon, decide to kill him? Was it truly the influence of the novel The Catcher in the Rye, as Chapman later claimed, or were there deeper, more complex motivations at play? And why, after committing such a horrific act, did Chapman calmly wait for the police to arrest him? These questions would fuel both legal proceedings and a series of theories that would follow in the years to come. Yet, even as Lennon's death was met with confusion and mourning, his legacy lived on. The music he created, the messages he left behind, and the example he set would continue to inspire future generations. Though his life was tragically cut short, John Lennon's influence would remain, forever woven into the fabric of music history. The death of John Lennon sent shockwaves across the globe. Within moments of the news breaking, the world was plunged into an ocean of grief. Fans around the world, particularly in New York City, were left stunned, unable to comprehend that the man who had given them so much through his music, his words, and his ideals was gone. The immediate aftermath was a scene of mourning, confusion, and a collective sense of disbelief. Outside the Dakota, where Lennon had been shot, fans gathered in droves paying their respects. They laid flowers, lit candles, and sang songs in his memory, all while trying to process the sudden loss of an icon. It wasn't just his music that people mourned. It was the very essence of who he was. Lennon had represented more than just the voice of a generation. He was a beacon of peace in a world that often seemed chaotic. His activism, particularly his anti-war stance, had made him a symbol of hope for millions who shared his vision of a better world. The media frenzy that followed Lennon's death was immediate and relentless. News outlets around the world, from television networks to newspapers, broadcasted the tragic event, trying to piece together the details of the assassination. The public learned about Mark David Chapman's obsession with The Catcher in the Rye and the bizarre motivations behind the shooting. But despite the constant flow of information, one question remained unanswered. Why did Chapman choose to kill Lennon? The grief wasn't confined to his fans alone. Fellow musicians who had grown up with Lennon's music and revered him as a genius were equally devastated by the news. Paul McCartney, who had shared a complex and sometimes strained relationship with Lennon, was one of the first to speak out publicly after the murder. McCartney was in disbelief, reflecting on the years of friendship and music that he had shared with Lennon. "I'm in shock, but I still can't quite believe it," McCartney said in a statement. The death of his former bandmate was not just the loss of a friend, it was the loss of a piece of history, a symbol of a musical revolution. Other notable musicians, such as George Harrison and Ringo Starr, also expressed their sorrow. Harrison, who had always had a deep connection with Lennon, described him as a great soul. The Beatles, as a group, had revolutionized music and culture, and now, with Lennon's death, it felt as though an era had ended. The public mourning extended beyond just those who knew him personally. Lennon's passing was felt in every corner of the world. As the grief mounted, so did the questions. Why had Chapman killed Lennon? What had driven him to commit such an atrocious act? Was it really just his obsession with a book, or was there something more at play? These questions would linger for years. Has the world tried to make sense of a senseless act? In the following days, tributes poured in from all corners of the globe. Fans gathered for vigils, and Lennon's music played continuously on the radio, on television, and in public spaces. His death, while tragic, had created a sense of unity among people from all walks of life. The world had lost a hero, but his legacy of peace, love, and music would continue to live on. Following the assassination of John Lennon, the investigation into his death began almost immediately. The New York Police Department, already accustomed to dealing with high-profile cases, moved quickly to piece together the details of the crime. Lennon had been shot outside his apartment in the Dakota, a location frequented by both celebrities and regular citizens, meaning there were multiple witnesses to the tragic event. But the most important aspect of the investigation came when the authorities turned their focus to Mark David Chapman, the man who had taken Lennon's life. Chapman, who had remained on the scene after the shooting, had not attempted to flee. Instead, he sat on the ground near the Dakota, casually reading a copy of The Catcher in the Rye as he waited for the police to arrive. When the officers finally reached him, Chapman reportedly said, "I just shot John Lennon." He did not resist arrest. His calm demeanor and lack of remorse immediately raised more questions about his mental state and motivations. Once Chapman was taken into custody, the investigation began in earnest. The police quickly learned of Chapman's obsession with The Catcher in the Rye and how it seemed to shape his distorted worldview. Chapman had, in the months leading up to the shooting, repeatedly referenced the book, claiming that he identified with the protagonist Holden Caulfield, who despised what he saw as the phoniness of the adult world. Chapman believed that Lennon, despite his peace-promoting persona, was a phony, and that by killing him he was somehow doing the world a favor. His fixation on the novel seemed to suggest a profound disconnect from reality, and the idea of John Lennon being a phony was just one of many signs that Chapman was mentally unstable. The investigation also revealed that Chapman had been planning the assassination for weeks. He had visited New York several times prior to December 8th, scouting out the Dakota and even rehearsing his plan. On the day of the shooting, Chapman had waited for Lennon outside the building, nervously walking around as he awaited his chance. When Lennon finally emerged with Yoko Ono, Chapman saw his opportunity and approached. After taking the fatal shot, Chapman simply stood by, calmly waiting for the police to arrest him. During his interrogation, Chapman expressed no remorse. He appeared almost detached from the gravity of his crime, providing chilling statements about his actions. His lack of empathy was disturbing, but it also raised further questions about his mental state. Was this a crime of passion, or was it a carefully calculated act by a man who believed he was acting in a delusional reality? The legal proceedings that followed were equally unsettling. Mark David Chapman was charged with second-degree murder and held without bail. His defense team initially planned to argue that he was not guilty by reason of insanity, citing his erratic behavior and obsession with The Catcher in the Rye. The trial was closely watched by the media, and Chapman's mental health became a central point of debate. Was he truly insane, or was he a man with a twisted ideology who had simply carried out a heinous act of violence? In June 1981, Chapman pled guilty to the murder of John Lennon. The court accepted his guilty plea, and he was sentenced to 20 years to life in prison. His lack of remorse and the apparent randomness of the act disturbed the public and left many struggling to understand how someone could commit such a senseless crime. Chapman's obsession with Lennon, combined with his unstable mental health, made the tragedy all the more incomprehensible. John Lennon's death on December 8, 1980, marked the end of an era. Yet even in death, his influence did not wane. In fact, it only grew stronger as fans, musicians, and activists continued to honor his legacy. Lennon had always been more than just a musician. He was a cultural force, a symbol of peace, love, and rebellion. His contributions to the world, through both his music and his activism, were far-reaching, and his sudden death only deepened his status as a cultural icon. In the years following his death, Lennon's music and message continued to resonate with people around the world. Songs like Imagine, Give Peace a Chance, and Working Class Hero became anthems for peace movements, civil rights struggles, and anti-war protests. His lyrics, which had once been seen as the idealistic musings of a rock star, were now revered as profound statements on human nature, war, and social justice. Lennon had spoken out against injustice at a time when doing so was controversial, and his words, now imbued with even greater significance, continued to inspire those who were fighting for change. One of the most poignant ways in which Lennon's legacy was preserved was through the ongoing popularity of his solo work. Imagine, his most famous solo album, became not just an artistic achievement, but also a rallying cry for those who sought a more peaceful world. The title track, with its simple yet profound lyrics, encouraged listeners to imagine a world without borders, without war, and without suffering, a world in which humanity lived in harmony. The song's enduring popularity ensured that Lennon's message of hope and peace would never be forgotten. In addition to his music, Lennon's activism left an indelible mark on the world. His outspoken opposition to the Vietnam War, his advocacy for civil rights, and his vocal support for women's rights and gay rights had made him a hero to many. His involvement in protests, particularly with his wife Yoko Ono, had raised awareness about the importance of standing up for what is right. Lennon had often used his platform to speak out against political corruption and social inequality, and his commitment to these causes was seen as an extension of the idealism that defined his music. Lennon's death also prompted a wave of tributes from fellow musicians, friends, and fans. Paul McCartney, his former Beatles bandmate, was one of the most prominent figures to express his grief. McCartney's tribute to Lennon was not just in words, but in the music he continued to make. Despite the complicated relationship they had during their years together in the Beatles, McCartney was deeply affected by Lennon's passing, and he would later dedicate the song Here Today to his late friend. Other artists, such as Bruce Springsteen, David Bowie, and Elton John, also paid tribute to Lennon in various ways. These tributes highlighted the far-reaching impact that Lennon had on the world, not only as a musician but as a person who had used his platform to speak out for change. The world continued to feel the loss of Lennon, but his presence remained deeply felt in the music and activism of those who followed in his footsteps. Perhaps the most enduring aspect of Lennon's legacy is the message of peace that he carried throughout his life. In a world that often seems divided by conflict, hatred, and intolerance, Lennon's call for peace continues to resonate. His famous line from Imagine, "You may say I'm a dreamer, but I'm not the only one," reminds us that his vision of a better world is not just a fantasy, but something that can be achieved if enough people choose to believe in it. Even decades after his death, Lennon's influence is still evident. His music is played in homes, on the radio, in movies, and at public events, and his image, often with a peace sign or sporting round glasses, remains a symbol of hope and idealism. John Lennon's life and death serve as a powerful reminder that artists, musicians, and activists have the ability to change the world. His music, his activism, and his undying commitment to peace will continue to inspire generations to come, long after his untimely death. Lennon's memory is also preserved through various tributes and monuments. In New York City's Central Park, the Imagine mosaic has become a place of pilgrimage for fans from all over the world. The mosaic, which features the word Imagine in tribute to Lennon's song, is a place where people come to reflect on his life and legacy. It has become one of the most visited spots in New York, a testament to the lasting impact that Lennon had on the world. In addition to public memorials, Lennon's family has also played a role in keeping his legacy alive. His wife, Yoko Ono, continues to advocate for the causes that were important to both of them, including peace and social justice. Their son, Sean Lennon, has followed in his father's footsteps in the music industry, and he has often spoken about the profound impact his father had on his life. Through the work of Lennon's family, his influence continues to be felt, ensuring that his message of peace remains at the forefront of public consciousness. Ultimately, Lennon's legacy is not just about his music, but about the values he embodied. He was a man who, despite his flaws, spent his life fighting for a better world. His death was a tragic loss, but the enduring power of his message and the love he gave to the world through his music ensures that John Lennon's spirit will never truly fade. John Lennon's death not only altered the course of music history, but also had a profound and lasting effect on popular culture. The shock of his assassination reverberated through every facet of the cultural landscape, from music to film, fashion, and activism. His influence transcended his time with the Beatles and his solo career, leaving a legacy that continued to shape cultural movements long after his untimely death. In the years immediately following Lennon's death, his influence on the music world remained undeniable. Many of the artists who grew up listening to the Beatles now took up the mantle of peace and social activism that Lennon had championed. The 1980s saw a rise in socially conscious music, with artists like U2, Bruce Springsteen, and Bob Dylan continuing Lennon's call for justice and equality. These musicians often cited Lennon as an influence, not just for his musical innovations, but for the way he used his platform to advocate for societal change. Lennon's message of peace, especially, continued to resonate during a period marked by political tensions. The early 80s were a time of Cold War rhetoric, nuclear fears, and growing unrest across the globe. In this environment, Lennon's idealism, exemplified in songs like Imagine, became more relevant than ever. His call for a world without war, without borders, without hate, became a rallying cry for activists and advocates seeking to heal societal divisions. Beyond the music, Lennon's death also had a significant impact on the film industry. The 1980s and beyond saw a wave of documentaries, books, and films chronicling Lennon's life and his enduring legacy. Films like Imagine John Lennon, 1988, a documentary made with the cooperation of his family, offered an intimate look at Lennon's life, showing him not just as a celebrity, but as a complex and deeply human figure. These films, along with numerous biographies and interviews, allowed new generations to discover Lennon's profound impact on music, culture, and society. Lennon's death also led to the creation of memorials and tributes that continue to serve as cultural landmarks. Perhaps the most significant of these is the Imagine mosaic in Central Park, New York City, which has become a pilgrimage site for Lennon fans worldwide. Visitors come to reflect on his life and ideals, often leaving messages of peace or flowers at the site. The memorial not only serves as a reminder of Lennon's work, but as a testament to the global movement he inspired. In the realm of fashion and style, Lennon's distinctive look, the round glasses, casual attire, and relaxed demeanor, became iconic in itself. His style became synonymous with counterculture movements and was adopted by those who sought to embody his laid-back yet politically aware persona. Even today, Lennon's image is often used as a symbol of rebellion and social change, with his face appearing on posters, T-shirts, and artwork that celebrate his life and ideals. Lennon's assassination also had a lasting impact on the way society views celebrity culture. The brutality of his death highlighted the dark side of fame, showing how it could attract obsessive fans and potentially lead to dangerous outcomes. This heightened awareness around celebrity safety, leading to increased precautions and changes in how public figures interacted with the press and fans. Lennon's death marked a shift in the relationship between celebrities and their audience, where the boundary between the public and private spheres became more pronounced. Perhaps most importantly, John Lennon's assassination underscored the power of his message. Even in death, Lennon's calls for peace and love, his critiques of war, and his advocacy for social change remained relevant to the ongoing struggles. of the world. The ideals he expressed in songs like Give Peace a Chance and Power to the People are just as needed today as they were during his lifetime. His death, though tragic, galvanized the global movement for peace, inspiring countless individuals and groups to carry forward his vision of a more compassionate and just world. Lennon's legacy continues to resonate with new generations, who continue to find solace in his music and inspiration in his life. His work is now a permanent part of the cultural canon, studied and admired by those who were too young to witness his creative genius during his lifetime. The message of peace, hope, and love that he championed remains as powerful today as it was in the 1960s and 1970s, ensuring that John Lennon's spirit will live on forever in the hearts and minds of people across the world. The tragic death of John Lennon on December 8, 1980, left an indelible mark on the world. In the years that followed, millions of people have struggled to come to terms with the loss of one of the most influential musicians and cultural figures of the 20th century. Lennon was not just the voice of the Beatles, but a symbol of peace, love, and social consciousness. His tragic end at the hands of Mark David Chapman forever altered the music industry and the cultural landscape. Yet his legacy remains as powerful and relevant today as it was during his lifetime. Lennon's life was one of constant evolution. From his early days with the Beatles to his solo career and his activism with Yoko Ono, Lennon's influence on both music and society was immeasurable. His music, which spanned across a range of genres and themes, resonated with millions and provided the soundtrack to a generation that sought change, peace, and unity. As a member of the Beatles, Lennon helped to reshape the music industry, pushing boundaries with his experimental approach to sound and his unapologetic pursuit of personal and artistic freedom. Beyond his music, Lennon's outspoken stance on political and social issues made him a controversial yet highly respected figure. His activism, particularly his opposition to the Vietnam War, his support for civil rights and his calls for peace, resonated deeply with the counterculture of the 1960s and 1970s. He used his platform not just for artistic expression, but to advocate for social justice, challenging the status quo and encouraging his fans to do the same. The shock of his assassination was not just a loss of a man, but the end of an era. For many, Lennon had come to embody the ideals of the 1960s, a time of social upheaval and idealism, where young people dreamed of a better world. His untimely death cut short what could have been even more revolutionary contributions to the world, leaving a sense of what might have been. Yet, in his absence, Lennon's voice still echoes through the generations. Lennon's legacy is multifaceted, extending far beyond his musical catalogue. His commitment to peace, his advocacy for human rights, and his unyielding belief in the power of love are timeless ideals that continue to resonate. Songs like Imagine, Give Peace a Chance, and Happy Xmas, War is Over remain as relevant today as they were when they were first written, offering both a reminder of the challenges we still face and a vision of the world we could strive to create. Through his death, Lennon's message of peace and unity became even more powerful. His fans, musicians, and activists who were inspired by his work and message continue to carry his torch, advocating for a better world through art, music, and action. The world that Lennon dreamed of, one of peace, understanding, and love, has not yet arrived, but his legacy serves as both a guide and a reminder that we still have the power to make it a reality. John Lennon may have been taken from us too soon, but his impact on music, culture, and society will never be forgotten. His life and work continue to inspire, challenge, and unite people around the world, making him an eternal figure in the pantheon of cultural icons. And as long as his music plays and his message of peace is remembered, Lennon will never truly be gone.